Hi there. We are back again with Let the Circle Be Unbroken. This will be chapter 2. And I wanted to say a big shout out to Miss Clay's class in Maryland. Thank you for requesting this book. I think it's going to be a good one. I did get an email from someone, and I'm assuming from Miss Clay's class, asking about the history of TJ. Apparently, this book will go into a lot of what happens to TJ as a result of what happened in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. If you want to know more about what happened with TJ, you'll need to listen to chapters 8 through 12 from Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. But in a nutshell, TJ was not well liked by anyone, but Stacy was his best friend for all that he could be. TJ did some things earlier on in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which caused Mrs. Logan to lose her teaching job. And so there was a little bit of problem with the friendship there. Then he started running around with the white boys, the Simses, who were not great people. More like gang members, but they were white. So they always treated TJ as below them. And they decided that they wanted to cause some mischief at the local store, Mr. Barnett's store. And TJ was involved, and in the process, Mr. Barnett was killed. It was not TJ who did it, however. The white boys blamed it on TJ. He got beaten up pretty badly and went to Stacy, who was at this point not really talking to him. But Stacy helped TJ to get home one night, and then TJ was thrown in jail for the killing of Mr. Barnett. So that's basically it. But the details are much more informative than what I've just given you. So please go and listen to chapters 8 through 12 in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry on this channel. And I'll put the link to the first video, chapter 8, in the description box below this video. So let's start with chapter 2. Let the Circle Be Unbroken. Clarence Hopkins brought the news. He dashed across the school lawn just minutes before the afternoon bell was to ring, crying out to Stacy, who was standing with little Willie Wiggins, Mo Turner, and several other 8th grade boys beside the tree which shaded the well. He caused such a ruckus with his yelling that all the students still lingering outside were alerted that something important was up. Immediately, some boy, Maynard, and I left the steps of the middle grades building to join the growing circle as Little Man and Christopher John came running from the far corner of the tool shed where they had been throwing horseshoes. By the time we had pushed our way into the group, Clarence was already into his story. He had gone home for lunch and had gotten the news from his mother, who had gotten it from Mrs. Silas Lanier, who had just come back from Strawberry. TJ Avery was to go on trial next month. "You sure?" questioned Stacy. "They gonna really let him have a trial?" "That's what Mr. Lanier said," Clarence replied between gasps to recover his breath. He had run all the way from home. "He said it's all over town. That's all the white folks talking about." Clarence breathed in deeply before he continued. They say there ain't no need of no trial. But Mr. Jameson, he been worrying all this time to get one. He sure enough got it. My daddy said a trial ain't gonna do no good, remarked Mo, a quiet, gentle boy who usually had little to say in a crowd, but whose opinion was always respected. Maybe not, agreed little Willie, but leastways he got one. That's better'n nothing, I expect. Stacy frowned. Don't know about that. They ain't gonna believe what TJ's got to say, no way, so what's the use of a trial? His words were bitter, and no one attempted to answer him as silence settled over the group. Then Stacy asked if anyone had seen TJ. Nobody I know about, said Clarence, except maybe his folks and Mr. Jameson. He was silent a moment, then added, I'd sure like to go to that trial. At first, no one commented. Then little Willie scratched his head. You suppose they gonna let colored folks in? Clarence looked surprised. I don't see why not. We got a right. What day is it? Stacy asked, brusquely ignoring Clarence's summation of what rights he thought he had. The 10th, answered Clarence, unruffled. December 10th. Mo turned to Stacy. You gonna try to go? You go, I'll go. I looked at Stacy, curious as to what he would say, but he didn't answer. The afternoon bell began to ring and he left the circle. The rest of us watched him go. Then we were forced by the bell to disperse. Christopher John in the 3rd grade and little men in the 2nd slowly wandered off to the primary grades building. Some boy, Maynard, and I crossed in silence to the middle grades building, where we went into our 5th grade classroom and wordlessly slipped into our seats. Class began, and I opened my book with T.J. Avery on my mind. On a dry day, the walk home took about an hour. On wet days, what with all the slipperiness of the mud road and having to scramble onto the forest bank to avoid any passing vehicle, the journey took some 15 minutes longer. Today the weather was fine, and we arrived at the school at the 2nd crossroads in good time. With the long shadowing arms of the Granger forest trees stretching over us, we walked the last half-mile toward home. Finally, towering alone and beacon-like, the old oak which marked the boundary of our 400 acres came into view. On the right side of the road, the forest continued. On the left, it ended, leaving in its stead the massive oak and the open richness of red Mississippi farmland. Beyond the oak lay the east pasture, and beyond it the cotton field, left dead-looking by the August fire, which had started there and swept across the rows of green and purple stalks, taking fine puffs of white cotton, ready for picking, and bowls of flowered richness still blooming. The fire destroyed a quarter of the year's crop and damaged much of the rest with its smoke and heat. The pasture, which before the fire had boasted a soft greenness, was scorched brown, and the oak had been singed by the heat of the fire. A fire Papa himself had started to stop the lynching of TJ. But no one, except the family and Mr. Wade Jameson, knew Papa had set the fire. It was too dangerous for anyone else to know. The fire had not extended beyond the pasture. Men who had come to hang TJ had ended up fighting the fire instead, in order to stop its encroachment eastward to the Granger forest. None of Mr. Harlan Granger's 6,000 acres had been touched. The cotton field ran to within 100 feet of the house and was bordered with a barbed wire fence which continued to the back of the house and the garden gate. Past the fields was the lawn, long and sloping upward to the house. On its western edge, a dusty driveway cut from the road to the barn. Beyond the lawn and the drive lay the west fields where the hay, corn, soybeans, and sugar cane were planted each spring. The fire hadn't burned them, but it wouldn't have mattered as much as if it had. Mostly the hay and the soybeans and the sugar cane were not cash crops. It was the cotton we depended upon for our income. Perhaps too much. Going up the drive, we followed the path of giant rocks leading to the back porch and entered the house through the kitchen. There we found Big Ma at her usual place by the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot smelling strongly of collard greens. One look at her, and it was evident where Papa had gotten all his looks. Tall and strongly built, her coloring was the same pecan brown, and she carried no fat. She turned as we came in with a smile that started vanishing when she saw our faces. The years had taught her to discern whenever something was wrong, and before we could say anything, she demanded to know what was the matter. When Stacy told her, she shook her head, muttering, "Lord, Lord," and absently continued to stir the collards. Stacy watched her a moment, then went through the curtained doorway, which separated the closet-like kitchen from the dining room, and into the room he shared with Christopher John and Little Man, to the right of it. Christopher John and Little Man followed him, but I stayed behind to ask Big Ma about Mama and Papa and Mr. Morrison. Once I had found out where they were, I left as well, going through the dining room and Mama and Papa's room to the room Big Ma and I had shared. There I finally shed the school dress and slipped into the comfort of well-worn pants. My first impulse was to toss the dress on a chair, but knowing the fussing that was sure to come, I was about to hang it up when I heard a wagon turning into the drive, and deciding on first things first, tossed it anyway and ran outside. The wagon rolled to a stop, and Mr. L.T. Morrison stepped down. An awesome figure, Mr. Morrison was, over 7 feet tall, with a skin that was black, hair that was gray, and bulging muscles of an iron-like hardness, despite his 63 years. He smiled down at me in his gentle way and spoke in a voice that rolled low and deep. "Hello, Mr. Morrison," I said quietly. He walked to the back of the wagon, where a hay loader was sitting, and lifted it out, a task that should have taken 2 men. I followed him as he took the hay loader into the barn, then out again, and helped him clear the rest of the wagon. After a while, he looked down at me curiously. "You mighty quiet there, Cassie." "Yes, sir." "Anything the matter?" I looked up at him. "TJ got himself a trial next month." He appeared just a bit surprised, then softly touched my head with his giant hand. "That's better than nothing, Cassie." "Yes, sir," I said, continuing the unloading, but he and I both knew it wasn't much better. When the boys came out, they spoke to Mr. Morrison, who watched us all with worried eyes. Then the 4 of us crossed the road to the forest. Hearing the thudding echo of an axe beating out a dull rhythm, we followed the trail that wound through the pines and oaks and sweet gums to a vast clearing where standing trees gave way to those that had fallen more than a year ago, when lumbermen had come and chopped them down. Mama stood alone near the pond, chopping one of the fallen trees for firewood. A tall, thin woman with fragile beauty, in a strong-jawed face, she hardly looked to have the strength needed to swing the axe in such a hefty fashion, but her looks were deceiving. She had been born in the Delta, a sharecropper's daughter, and she knew hard work. At 19, she had come to Spokane County to teach. A year later, she had married Papa. Since then, she had worked as hard as he to keep the farm going. And when Papa had gone to work on the railroad in Louisiana, Mama had not only run the farm, but had continued to teach as well. That is, she had taught until Holland Granger had decided it was too dangerous to have her teaching, and she had been fired, supposedly for destroying school property. But everyone knew what the real reason was. Mama had organized a boycott against the Wallaces, white brothers who ran the store on the Granger plantation. And Holland Granger hadn't liked that, not one little bit. And when Holland Granger didn't like something, he always did something about it. She stopped chopping as we entered the clearing and smiled at us. Sinking the axe into a log, she took off the raw leather gloves she wore and the scarf which revealed long hair neatly pulled into a chignon at the nape of her neck. "How was school?" she asked. "All right," said Stacy, looking around. "Where's Papa?" Mama wiped the back of her hand across her forehead and went over to the water pail. "He's down farther." "Mama, y'all here?" "Hear what, honey?" She uncovered the pail and dipped out some water with a ladle. "'Bout TJ." Mama looked at Stacy, the ladle at her lips. "Come next month, he gonna get a trial." Mama lowered the ladle without drinking. "Where'd you hear that?" "At school. Clarence found out when he gone home for dinner. Mr. Lanier was there and he'd just come back from Strawberry. Said that's all folks is talking about." "I can imagine." "What this mean, Mama?" Christopher John asked. "This mean TJ gonna come home now?" Mama poured the water, untouched, back into the pail. Suddenly she looked weary. "No, that's not what it means." "Well, what it mean?" "Means they can do it legally now." "What's that, Mama?" There had been a better edge to Mama's voice as she spoke. Now she turned from the wagon to look directly at Christopher John, his round face showing bewilderment at this latest news about TJ's. And her words were softer. "A trial means that TJ can tell his story, and there'll be people there who'll decide whether he's telling the truth or not." "Then that means he'll be coming on home then." Christopher John smiled happily at this conclusion. "No." Her eyes went slowly over each of us. "No. The people who will hear TJ and make the decision will be white. There'll be somebody else who'll be saying that what TJ says is not the truth. He'll be white too. There'll be a judge there and he'll be white. All white. Do you understand?" She paused. "TJ won't be coming home." She looked down at Christopher John, who was still very much disturbed. "What is it?" It took him a moment to speak. When he did, the fear that welled in his voice. Mama, you think they'll ever come get us like they've done TJ?" "Us?" She looked surprised at his asking. "They got no reason to come after us." "But they come after TJ." "I know." "Well, it ain't fair," he objected. "TJ, he ain't done nothing, and now folks say they gonna hang him." "Now, wait just a minute. You call breaking into that store nothing? That was wrong, and there's no way around it. It was wrong, too, for TJ to be running around with those white boys in the first place. He knew that, but he was too hard-headed to listen to anybody. And this trouble he's in is what came of it." Her voice had risen angrily as she spoke, for it deeply bothered her that she had seen TJ's downfall coming and had been unable to prevent it. She calmed herself and went on. "You know, there's nothing I'd like better in this world than to make what happened this summer not to have happened. But it did, and not your papa or Big Ma or Mr. Morrison or me or anybody can make it go away. We teach you what we do to keep you safe. The way things are down here, what happened to TJ was bound to come. I don't like it, and your papa doesn't like it, and most decent folks don't like it. But right now, all we can do is try to keep it from happening again." "But what about TJ, Mama?" Christopher John persisted. "He gonna die?" Mama put a slender arm around him. "On that, baby, we'll just have to wait and see." For a moment we stood in silence, only the forest sounds cracking the stillness. Then Stacy muttered something about finding Papa and rounding the pond, headed northward. As he left, Mr. Morrison drove up in the wagon, and we began to load the firewood. When Stacy returned with Papa a short time later, Mama looked at Papa and said, "Stacy tell you?" Papa nodded, and swooping little man up, set him onto the back of the wagon and gave him a stick of wood to stack. Little man quickly placed the stick at the wagon's head, then ran back for more. "Y'all got quite a bit of chopping done down in here," Mr. Morrison said, as he brought an armload of wood to the wagon. Papa looked around the clearing. "It'll be a while yet before it's all cleared out. Them lumbermen did a lot of damage. A lot of damage. Got another load stacked farther down. We finish this, then in the morning I figure we'll go get that other." Papa turned to Stacy. For a moment Stacy faltered, then he said, "Papa, I want to go to that trial." Mama, walking toward the wagon with an armload of wood, stopped so suddenly several sticks fell off. "Now that's the last thing you're going to do," she said. "Mama, I gotta go. TJ gonna need me. Maybe there's something I can say. Maybe tell him about him coming here that night." "You think these people are going to believe anything you have to say? TJ's going to trial for an all-white jury and a white judge in a town and a state and a country ruled by white folks. For you to get up there and say anything will just make it worse." Stacy's look was defiant. "I seen him that night 'fore them men come. Could tell him what TJ said, tell how beat up he was." "Now, just calm down here a minute," Papa said. "You done a lot of learning and a lot of growing the last few years. And I figure you know by now things ain't fair in this life for hardly nobody. And for a black person, they ain't hardly no such thing. Now, we done all we could for TJ the night of the fire. But I tell you, son, there ain't nothing else we can do. He's in the hands of the law now. And that law, just like just about everything else in this country, is made for the white folks. You get up there talking about being with TJ that night, maybe them white folks in town might just get to thinking you was one of them boys broke in that store with TJ." Stacy looked uneasy. "TJ, he'll tell him it wasn't me, that it was them Simses." Papa waited a moment, his eyes hard on Stacy. "And you think the jury's gonna believe that?" Stacy was silent. He glanced at the pond, then back at Papa and Mama. His eyes changed. The realization had hit him. It had hit me, too. I felt a surging feeling of panic at the thought of Stacy's facing the same ordeal as TJ. After all, Stacy had been with TJ the night Jim Lee Barnett had been killed, and he had helped him. We all had. He didn't say anything else. Turning away, he gathered several more sticks of firewood and, in silence, put them on the wagon. After supper, we sat before the fire in Mama and Papa's room as we did each evening, attending to our evening tasks. The boys and I at our table by the window attempting to study. Big Ma sewing, Mama reading, Papa bending the sole of Christopher John's shoe, and Mr. Morrison carving a piece of wood which had not yet taken on a shape of its own. Sounds of the fire popping and of Mr. Morrison's knife scraping against the wood blended with Big Ma's soft humming, lending a quiet peace. As the evening wore on, we heard a car on the road and we all looked up. Mr. Morrison, sitting near the front window, stood and pushed the curtain back. The boys and I peered out into the darkness with him, watching as a faint light coming from the east illuminated the road, growing brighter as it neared. Finally, the car slowed and turned up the drive. Mr. Morrison waited a moment until the driver stepped out, then said, "It's Wade Jameson." For longer than was necessary, and with his car headlights still on, Mr. Jameson poked around his front seat as if arranging his briefcase, a procedure he always followed whenever he came at night so that we could see who it was. When Papa called out to him, he turned out his lights and came up the rock path to the porch, leaving the briefcase behind. He shook Papa's hand and, taking off his hat, greeted the rest of us. Since the night of the fire, we had not seen Mr. Jameson very much. We had heard he had had troubles of his own. His defense of TJ that night had caused his unpopularity in the white community to grow even further. And the week following the lynching attempt, his office had been burned, then his dog poisoned. It was said, too, that threats had been made against both him and his wife. But Mr. Jameson himself has never mentioned the threats to us. What he had said, however, was that his family was old line Mississippi, and not even Beelzebub himself was going to run him out or change his way of thinking. I believed him, too. Mama offered him one of the rockers, and he sat down tentatively, as was his custom, crossing one long leg over the other. In his 50s, with graying hair and sad gray eyes, Mr. Jameson was one of the few adult white people that I truly liked. "I'm only going to be here a minute," he explained as Mama took his hat and laid it on the bed. "I was just down to the Averys and thought I'd stop by before I went back to town to see if you'd heard about the trial." As usual, Mr. Jameson came straight to the point. He understood as well as we did that the friendship and goodwill we shared with him was different from that which we shared with our neighbors in the black community, or that which he shared with his friends in the white community. There was a mutual respect, and because the years had proven it justified, a mutual trust. But there was no socialization other than the amenities. Neither he nor we would have felt comfortable in such a situation, for the unwritten laws of the society frowned upon such fraternization, and the trust and respect were valued and needed more than the socializing. "We got the news this afternoon," Papa replied. "The children heard about it at school." Mr. Jameson glanced over at the boys and me and then back to Papa. "Judge Havishak will be presiding. I tried for Judge Forrester, who's quite a bit more free-thinking, but he was tied up in something else up at Tree Hill. Hadley Maccabee from Vicksburg will be prosecuting." Papa was silent a moment before he observed, I don't suppose it really matters that much who the judge or the prosecutor is, does it? It's the jury's got to decide, and I figure it made up its mind long before that boy broke into the store. Mr. Jameson sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. A different kind of judge, though, maybe could make a difference. A big difference. Papa shrugged. You naturally got more faith in the law than I do. Mr. Jameson took Papa's comment in silence. Papa had no illusions about the trial, and Mr. Jameson knew it. He glanced around the room before he spoke again. David, there's been something that's been on my mind quite a little while. And now that we've got the trial coming up, I think it best we talk about it. I stopped breathing and glanced at Stacy. His eyes did not move from Mr. Jameson. It's about your children. Relief was on Stacy's face. I began to breathe again. Mr. Jameson was not going to talk about the fire. Now, I've spoken to TJ, and he's told me all his actions on the night Jim Lee was killed. I know that he came by here first and that your children helped him get back home. Christopher John and Little Man shot a nervous glance at Stacy, their eyes revealing their worry that we might be in trouble all over again. Mr. Maccabee is aware of this as well, but he and I both agree that there's no point in taking TJ's testimony beyond the time he says he got a ride back from Strawberry. If we go beyond that time, we'll have to get into the whole business of the lynching attempt, and Maccabee doesn't want that, and I don't want your children involved in any way. Papa nodded and Mama said, We appreciate that, Mr. Jameson, more than you know. Mr. Jameson appeared to be somewhat embarrassed by Mama's words. He looked at her, allowing a slight nod. Excuse me, Mr. Jameson, said Stacy, but there any chance of colored folks getting to be on that jury? I expected Mama and Papa to reproach Stacy for butting into so serious a conversation. Neither did. Mr. Jameson's gray eyes met Stacy's, and his answer came as straightforward as always. Selection of jurors is made from people registered to vote, Stacy. Seeing that there are no colored voters in Spokane County, there won't be any colored voters to draw from. And even if there were a colored person was called to duty, there'd be so much pressure on him, he probably wouldn't serve anyway. Well, ain't there nothing can be done for TJ? Mr. Jameson studied the floor for a moment, then looked back at Stacy. Son, I'll promise you this. I'll be doing all I can. What I'm planning to do is put TJ on the stand. That means, of course, that he'll have to admit to the burglary. But if he can testify, I'm hoping that I can convince the jury that he was not the one who killed Jim Lee Barnett. If I don't put him on the stand, we don't have anything. After all, there's that farmer who picked him up right outside of Strawberry, and R.W. Melvin and Melvin Sims will be testifying that they saw him running from the mercantile. And then there was that pearl-handled gun found in TJ's mattress. I can perhaps punch some holes in the prosecutor's case, but not enough. He'll have to take the stand. And if they don't believe him, then we'll try to get an appeal, another trial. Stacy nodded and said no more. Mr. Jameson waited as if expecting more questions. I kept hoping that one of the grown-ups would ask the questions I would have liked to ask about the proceedings, but none of them did. It was as if the verdict was already in. With no more questions asked, Mr. Jameson said, "David, there was something else. I was wondering if any of you are planning on going to the trial." Papa took his pipe from his pocket and hit it hard against his palm, as if he expected ashes to come out. But, since there had been no tobacco for several months, the action was more out of habit than expectation. "Don't know yet. The Averys are close friends." "I know that," said Mr. Jameson, his words slow and spaced and full of meaning. "They know it too. They know also how folks in town feel about you. That feeling, it's still there. And if you or Mr. Morrison or any of your family go into town, it could make things worse for the boy. Folks haven't forgotten about the boycott, and they blame you for it." He paused and added, "And then there's still the coincidence of that fire." My heart began to race wildly. Papa put the pipe in his mouth. He never said anything where any white people were concerned, not even Mr. Jameson, without having carefully thought it through first. There was no rush in him. Withdrawing the pipe, he smiled faintly. "I ain't hardly forgotten that. You think I would?" Mr. Jameson returned his smile, showing he understood. "No, David didn't think you had." He stood up. "Well, I guess I'd best be getting on back toward town. My wife's probably been looking for me this past hour. Miss Logan, I'd like to thank you for my hat." When Mr. Jameson had left, with both Papa and Mr. Morrison walking out with him, Big Ma commented, "It's sure gotta be hard on that man trying to help TJ like he is." "Probably more than we know," Mama said. We heard the car leave, and after a few minutes, when Papa and Mr. Morrison did not return, Little Man went to the front door and opened it. "Clayton Chester, don't you go out there," Mama said, forbidding his leaving with his given name, so seldom used. Little Man glanced back at Mama, not daring to disobey, but there was fear in his eyes. For since the fire, he had been afraid that Papa or Mr. Morrison or Stacy would leave at night and never return. "But Papa—" "He's all right. Mr. Morrison, too. Now close the door." Little Man obeyed, but didn't move from the door. As soon as he heard footsteps on the steps, swung it open. Papa's eyes met Mama's as he entered and saw Little Man. "Well, thank you, son," he said. Little Man trembled, and Papa took his hand. "Looks like old man Winter's gone and got you cold. I expect you best get your book and come sit over here closer to me and this fire and get yourself warm." Little Man hurried to do his bidding. Retrieving his book, he dashed back to Papa's side, and taking the chair, which Papa had pulled close to his own, he opened his book, then looked up at Papa. Papa winked at Little Man smiled. He remained at Papa's side the rest of the evening. The days before the trial were long and filled with few thoughts other than what would happen to TJ. At school, older students talked of little else. At home, Mama and Papa tried to make the boys and me see that most likely the trial would change nothing. They still did not want us to get our hopes up. Still, though, I knew they believed what they told us. I couldn't help but wish that a miracle would happen and TJ would go free. After all, the Bible was always talking about miracles. I figured that if Daniel could get out of the lion's den alive and Jonah could come up unharmed from the belly of a whale, then surely old TJ could get out of going to prison. TJ consumed my mind. Each night I prayed long and hard, asking God to save him. And once I was asleep, my dreams swept me back to the heat of the August night when TJ had come pounding on our door, and Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I sneaked out into the thundering night to walk him home, only to deliver him into the hands of a mob ready to lynch him. Sometimes in those dreams I became TJ, and I awoke with a scream, shaken and unable to dispel the memory of the coarse rope binding my neck. Big Ma would hold me to her, and Mom and Papa would come in from the next room, but I would not talk about the dreams. They were too real. I knew that Mom and Papa were worried about the boys and me. Sometimes I found them and Big Ma and Mr. Morrison as well, watching us as if trying to read our thoughts. When they talked to us about what we could expect of the trial, about what could happen to TJ, we listened but said very little, for it seemed that everything had already been said. All of us, I believed, that they worried most about, of all of us that I believed, that they worried most about Stacy. He was silent and moody and was always going off alone to the pond or the fields or the pasture. More than once I saw Papa and Mama staring after him when he went, but they said nothing to him. Once Mama had started to follow, but Papa held her back. Ain't nothing more we could say to him, sugar. What he got to do is work it out in his own head how things are. He need us, he'll come on back and talk. Mama conceded somewhat doubtfully to Papa and had not followed, but I had. I was worried about Stacy too. I knew that he was upset not only because of what was happening to TJ, but because Mom and Papa were not allowing him to go to the trial. When I caught up with him, I tried to talk to him about it. Boy, how come you moping around like you are? Don't it make sense to you how come Papa decided not to go to that trial? Stacy didn't answer. And how come they ain't gonna let you go either? Stacy looked at me and turned away. There had been an old man's sorrow in his eyes, and a deepening frown across his forehead, which now seemed always to be there. You know, I said, what happened to TJ? It ain't your fault. Oh, I know that. It's just that... What? I just keep thinking that maybe I should have tried more to talk some sense into him. Couldn't nobody talk any sense into TJ, and you know it, I exclaimed, not liking to see him this way. TJ was a fool, and if the truth was known, most likely still is. Stacy cast me a disapproving glance, as if TJ's impending fate made it disrespectful to talk of him this way, but I didn't care. It was the truth. Stacy shook his head at my outspokenness, then dismissed it and confided. Little Willie's talking about going to the trial. Is? Stacy nodded. Clarence, too. I grew scared. You ain't thinking about disobeying Papa and trying to go. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine to see if he could trust me. I tried to hide my fear, but it showed through. Ah, little Willie and Clarence, they just talking, he scoffed, with a hurried laugh. I stared at him suspiciously. You sure? Don't worry, ain't none of us going nowhere. But I did worry, and on the morning of the trial I found that all my fears had been justified. As Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I approached the second roads on the way to school, Mo and Clarence were waiting. We got us a way in, Clarence announced as soon as we were within earshot. Immediately I pounced on him. A way into where? Clarence, looking somewhat uneasy, hooked his arm into Stacy's and stepped with him and Mo to the side of the road. Christopher John, Little Man, and I stepped right behind them. Ain't Callie Jackson sending Joe into Strawberry for something or another? Stacy looked up the road. You asked him about taking us? Yeah, he said okay. You tell him how come we want to go? Clarence shook his head. Said we had some errands. We'll tell him later. He waiting, so we better go. Weed? I exclaimed. Stacy ain't going nowheres. Stacy ignored me. Mo, you going? Mo shrugged. Like I said, you go, I'll go. Stacy, you know you can't go. Papa gonna wear you out. You go. Go where? Little man inquired. Cassie, I don't go. I most likely ain't never gonna see TJ again. Go where? Little man repeated. Well, that ain't no great loss, I cried, too afraid for Stacy's safety at the moment to concern myself with TJ's future. You getting into trouble ain't gonna help him none. Look, Stacy, we gonna have to go, 'cause Joe ain't likely to wait too long, urged Clarence. Where's he waiting? Down past the school. Stacy glanced down toward Great Faith. What about little Willie? What he gonna do? Hadn't seen him yet, admitted Clarence, but he was talking like he'd go if we found a way to get into town. It's near 8 o'clock already, said Stacy. We ain't likely to get there now 'fore noon. And even if the trial's still going on, we aren't going to get back until after school's out. Mo nodded, acknowledging the precarious timetable. Stacy and Clarence looked at him and at each other, each aware of the fate which would be awaiting them upon their return. It was Stacy who made the decision. All right, let's get little Willie. Where y'all going? Little man demanded once more. They think they going to Strawberry, I told him. Christopher John's eyes widened. Strawberry? Stacy, you can't do that. Papa said. I know what Papa said, but this here is something I gotta do. I'll get my whipping when I come back, but I'm gonna have to go. Done made up my mind to that. Well, you just better unmake it, I advised. Stacy glared at me, but with no time to argue the point, started down the road toward school between Mo and Clarence. As Christopher John, Little Man, and I ran along behind them, I pleaded with Stacy, cajoled him, and threatened him with every dire consequence I could think of. But none of my talk changed his mind. When we reached Great Faith, he stopped. Now, y'all gonna have to let me do this my way. When school's out, y'all go on home and tell Papa what I done. What? Tell him what I done so's y'all won't get into trouble. I'll be all right. And with that, he walked up the lawn with Mo and Clarence in search of little Willie. Christopher John, Little Man, and I watched him go. Cassie, Stacy, he gonna be all right? Word Christopher John. I don't like him going all the way to that place by himself. Me neither, admitted Little Man. I made no comment as I watched Stacy, already nearing the middle grades building. In a few minutes he would be back again and on his way to Strawberry. I figured if I lit out running for home, Papa riding on Mare Lady could overtake Stacy before he got there. But only part of me wanted to do that. The other part wanted to jump on that wagon and go with him, not only to make sure he remained safe, but to see firsthand what was to become of TJ. I knew that Stacy would never allow me to go, but if he went, I knew good and well that I was going too. After all, a whipping could last for only so long, and a day like this perhaps would never come again. I made up my mind. I'm going to go with him, I said. Y'all go on up to school. Defied Little Man. Y'all going, I'm going. Oh, y'all crazy, Christopher John declared. Y'all know we can't be going all the way to Strawberry by ourselves. Look, Y'all just stay here. I gotta get on that wagon before Stacy comes. I ran down the road. Little man was right behind me and Christopher John coming at a slower, pudgier pace behind him. For a moment I faltered, wondering if I should turn back because of them, then ran on telling myself that they would be all right. When the wagon came into view, I stopped. I didn't see Joe, but sitting in the front seat turned sideways so that he saw us coming was Wardell Lees. Little man Christopher John and I glanced at each other, apprehensive about our proposed adventure and about approaching a figure as mysterious as Wardell. But there was no time to think about Wardell's peculiarities now. There was a tarpaulin on the wagon. If we were going anywhere, we had to get under it before the others came. "What you gonna say to him?" whispered Little Man. I shrugged, not knowing, and went on. Little Man and Christopher John came slowly behind. At the rear of the wagon, I nodded at Wardell. He did not nod back. Deciding that there was no time to say anything but the truth, I blurted out, "You mind if we get under this here thing, so's we can ride into town with y'all? Stacy, he's going too, but he don't want us to go. But we got to go if he go. But he can't know about it till we get on down the road toward town, so's he can't send us back. That be all right with you?" Wardell stared at us, his sandy eyes unreadable. Then he looked away into the woods as if it were no business of his. If the gesture was not one of permission, it was not denial either. And wasting no more time, I hurried into the wagon and under the tarpaulin. Little man quickly followed my lead, but Christopher John stood unmoving, staring up at us as if this time we really had gone mad. "Ain't y'all even thought about what Papa gonna do when he find out? And Mama and Big Ma, they's gonna be so worried." "We'll be back by the time we usually get home. Now shut up and get up here if you going. You ain't going, then get on back to school before Stacy sees you." Christopher John glowered angrily up at me, his face an anguish of indecision. I knew that he did not want to go, but I also knew that if the rest of us were committed to going, he would not be left behind. "Well," I demanded, "what you gonna do?" Grumbling, he got into the wagon. "How far is it, Cassie?" Little man asked, filled with curiosity about this town he'd never seen. 22 miles or so." "We gonna have to ride all the way there under this thing?" "No, just far enough so's they can't send us back. Now y'all both be quiet and don't move, and don't say nothing till I tell you. We sure enough gonna get a whipping." The road to Strawberry was rough and the wagon bed hard. As far as I could figure, we endured almost an hour under the tarpaulin before being discovered. At first I was afraid that Little Man or Christopher John, especially Christopher John, would give us away during the first few minutes. Then neither of them did. When neither of them did, I began to wonder how two little boys, who were usually so restless, could remain so still. Eventually I found out as the sound of soft snoring disrupted the quiet which had settled over the wagon. Immediately the tarpaulin was thrown back, and we faced the shock and then the wrath of the four older boys. "Y'all know what kind of trouble I'm in now," Stacy fumed. "Me going to Strawberry by myself, Papa would have whipped me, but he'd have understood. But y'all coming along? He ain't gonna understand that. Don't y'all know I'm responsible for y'all?" "Then you should have stayed at school," I responded, feeling stiff from having had to lie so still, and not at all like soothing his disturbed conscience. He stared at me with fierce hostility, then turned gloomily back to the road. Everyone waited for him to say something. "Joe," he called at last, "you gonna have to go back." "Oh, Stacy, what they gonna get into?" questioned little Willie. Look, you're going to get a whipping anyways, you look at it. So why don't we go on in like we planned so's we can be with TJ and come on back before your folks get a chance to be worried. We'll all watch out for 'em." Stacy looked away, trying to make up his mind. I started to say something, but decided I'd better not. "Things go for TJ the way folks say," Mo said softly. "We probably feel a lot worse than a whipping if we don't go." Mo's statement settled it, and we remained in the wagon. By noon, we were rolling down the main street of Strawberry. Christopher John and little man stared out at it with bright, curious eyes. But the rest of us, having been there before, glanced around dully in a hurry to get on to the trial. Nothing much about Strawberry had changed since I'd first seen it a year ago. The veranda still sagged, and the building still stared grayly out at the 3-block asphalt road, which, along with the spindly row of electrical poles lining it, brought the only touches of modernity to the place. The street, however, was strangely deserted. When I'd come the one time before, it had been market day, and the streets had been filled with country people and townspeople alike, sauntering along the sidewalks in and out of the shops. Now the doors to the shops were closed, and the few people whom we did see seemed to be in a hurry to get someplace else. We passed the mercantile which had belonged to Jim Lee Barnett. I pointed it out to little man and Christopher John. The shades were drawn as if it were closed, though I had heard that Mrs. Barnett, with the aid of her brother, had kept the store open after her husband's death. A farm wagon loaded down with a white family and household furniture was parked in front of the store. We glanced at them, then quickly looked away before they saw us. We guessed they had lost their farm. These days dispossessed farmers were not an uncommon sight. Another block down was where Mr. Jameson's office had stood, and where rebuilding was already underway. Across from his office was the courthouse square. But before we reached the square, Joe pulled up on the reins and stopped the wagon. "What you stopping here for?" demanded Clarence. "The courthouse is down that-a-way." Joe's eyes followed the direction of Clarence's finger pointed northward, up Main, then looked back at Clarence. "This here's as far as I'm gonna go this-a-way." "Aw, Joe, go on down to the courthouse," wheedled little Willie. "It ain't gonna take you but a minute." Joe shook his head with great animation. "Not me. No, sirree. One time I gone farther than this, and Mr. McGiver Street up there, and Mr. Deputy Haynes seen me, and he asked me what I was doing going down the street on the white folks' side of town. And I told him I ain't even knowed there was a white folks' side, and he says to me, he says, 'You knows it now.' Then he says he better not never catch me down there no more, less'n I got business, and he ain't gonna neither. Now y'all get on out and walk if y'all going, and don't be taking no long time coming back here, 'cause I's gonna be ready to go back home for that sun get past them trees yonder." "Oh, Joe, come on," started Clarence. "It ain't but a block," Stacy said, jumping down. "We just wasting time here." As soon as we were off the wagon, Joe, without a backward glance, let out a "Get on up on you," and rolled away. For a moment we stood watching the wagon and feeling just a bit deserted. Then, with Stacy leading the way, walked the block down Main to McGiver Street and turned up this dusty street to the courthouse. The courthouse was a wooden building in need of a coat of paint. It faced a wide yard and a colorful flower garden, which gave the area a festive air. Standing around the yard and on the steps were clusters of farm people, faded-looking men in faded overalls, and faded-looking women in dresses cut from brightly patterned cotton flour sacks. Townspeople stood apart from them, looking a bit smarter in their serge suits and store-bought fashions. "Is it over?" I said. No one knew, so no one answered. Not daring to ask any of the people gathered on the lawn, we made our way through the crowd to the other end of the building, where we saw an elderly Negro gentleman sitting under a gnarled pine. Stacy approached him and asked if the trial was over. He was told that the jury had only been selected. The trial was to start after lunch. The day was warm and the courtroom windows had been raised. We went over to the building and, climbing onto the concrete ledge which ran along its base, peeked in. Only a few people remained inside. A group of men stood talking at the front where two sizable tables and a towering desk set upon a platform dominated the room. Two women in dark, sober-looking hats and print dresses sat on a bench midway back, and at the very rear of the room, in the left-hand corner, sat Mr. and Mrs. Avery and 3 of their 8 children. With them were Mr. Silas Lanier and the Reverend Gabson, a few other members of Great Faith, and 3 people I didn't know. TJ was not in the room. We returned to the old man and asked him if he thought we could sit inside. He laughed. "Y'all young and see that speck of space the colored folks squatting in? Ain't none of 'em gonna move 'cause they's afraid they lose their space." "You mean that's all the room there is for the colored?" said Stacy. "What y'all see is all they is. White folks thinking they's doing good to louse that much." We thanked the man for his information, then settled beside him to wait for the trial to resume. We decided that since we could not get into the courtroom, we could station ourselves close enough to the windows to at least see TJ. As we waited, Mr. John Farnsworth, the county extension agent, walked past. Mr. Farnsworth was a pleasant-looking man whose job originally had been to visit all the farms in the area to give agricultural advice. But since last year, 1933, it had also included administering the government's crop control program, which meant keeping a close eye on each farmer's cotton production. Mama and Papa said that this additional responsibility had made him less than popular. Now, as he walked through the crowd, he was greeted with cold stares and angry grumblings. "Hey, Farnsworth," called a white farmer nearby. "Too bad it's near winter, ain't it? Ain't got no cotton for y'all to go plowing up." Mr. Farnsworth ignored the taunt and went up to the steps to the courthouse. The farmer stared malevolently after him, then spit on the ground. "Like to plow him up?" "Don't start," said a man with him, his voice stringently testy. I glanced over at the group and recognized the man as Mr. Tate Sutton, a white tenant on the Granger plantation. The first man turned angrily. "I'll doggone start if I wanna. Got a right to say many times this feels like it what Farnsworth done. Here I done planted them 10 acres in cotton a year ago this past spring, and told him and Mr. Granger come along, and told him, I done planted them 10 acres in cotton a year ago this past spring, and him and Mr. Granger come along and says I gotta plow 3 of 'em up. Lordy, all that seed and fertilizer and sweat gone to waste, and what I got to show for it, huh? John Farnsworth tells me the government gonna pay Mr. Granger, and Mr. Granger gonna pay me. But more'n a year done gone by, and I ain't seen a cent. Not a blasted cent." "And you think the rest of us have?" demanded Mr. Sutton. "You talking like you the only one it happened to." The first man looked away. A third man cleared his throat and spoke. "Hear tell there's some folks talking union." "Union," said Mr. Sutton. The first man turned back. "That's right. Say that maybe that's the only way we get our money." "You mean that union business with niggers?" said the first man. "Most likely." "Well, as far as I'm concerned, hell's gonna have to freeze over before I go joining anything with a stinking nigger." "Same here," hastily agreed the man who had brought up the union talk. "Things may be bad, but ain't nothing that bad. Lordy, nothing." The clusters of people began to break up and drift back into the court building. As they did, a thin boy with corn blonde hair wove his way toward us. It was Jeremy Sims, the younger brother of R.W. Melvin Sims. "Hey, Stacy, Mo, and y'all, all y'all," he said. Stacy and Mo stood to greet him. "Hey, Jeremy," we replied. "When y'all get here, didn't see you inside." "Few minutes ago," Stacy answered, without going into why we had not come earlier. "What's happening in there?" "They picked the 12 men for the jury, that's all." "Yeah, we know. It take all morning just for that?" Jeremy shrugged. "Folks say it shouldn't have, but Mr. Jameson, he was asking a lot of questions of every man up for jury duty." "Like what?" Jeremy looked uneasy. Like did they respect the law, and would they ever take the law into their own hands?" His voice trailed off, but we knew what Mr. Jameson had been trying to do. Everyone, black and white, knew of the attempted lynching. "No wonder it took so long," I muttered. "I'm right surprised they even got their 12. Stacy glanced at me with a harsh disapproval, warning me not to be so open about how I felt in front of Jeremy. The look was justified. It was just so hard to remember that I could not say, in Jeremy's presence, what I could when Mo or Little Willie or Clarence were around. For Jeremy was his friend despite being a Sims. More than once he had proven that friendship, and we all knew it, but he was still white, and that was what separated us, and we all knew that too. Resigning myself to saying nothing else, I got up and walked back over to the courthouse. Christopher John and Little Man went with me. "He there?" Christopher John asked as I climbed to the cement ledge and peered in. The benches were quickly filling, but the area in front was still empty. "Nope." "I gotta go," Little Man said. "Where's the outhouse?" I surveyed the area. "Maybe it's round back." I jumped down and we went to see. There was nothing. "I gotta go." "Well, go on over there in them bushes then," I suggested. "Won't nobody see." Little Man was outraged. "Hey, neither. There's folks all around here." I shrugged, ready to dismiss the problem and let Little Man work it out for himself, when I remembered what Uncle Hammer had said about some people in town having plumbing. "Maybe it's inside," I told him. Little Man looked doubtful. "Inside? What'd it be doing inside?" "Come on, we'll see," I said. We found a side door and we all went in. Following a narrow hallway, we came to double doors which opened to the main corridor. A man and woman, walking briskly as if they were afraid they might miss something, hurried toward us and turned into a room midway down the hall. 2 more people did the same. The rest of the corridor was empty. Christopher John nodded toward the open doors where the people had entered. "You suppose that's where they got TJ?" "Most likely that's a courtroom," I said. "Where's the outhouse?" I sighed irritably. At the moment, Little Man's mind was only on one thing. Leaving the protective cover of the doors, we ventured down the corridor, looking from side to side, not really sure what kind of structure we were looking for. "Look there," said Christopher John with a nod toward a man in the last stages of buttoning his pants coming through a door marked "Gentleman." Without a word, Little Man dashed down the corridor and through the door. Christopher John followed him. The man took no notice of either of them as he headed for the courtroom. For several minutes I waited outside the men's room. Then, drawn by the open doors, I went down to the courtroom entrance, where I tried to peek between the spaces not filled by people, several deep, lining the back wall. I thought about squeezing in and working my way around to where Reverend Gabson and the Averys were, but before I could make up my mind to do so, a man stepped to the doors and closed them. It hadn't been such a great idea anyway. With nothing further to see, I turned and headed back down the corridor. As I did, a young woman came from an office and bent over a water fountain. I watched her drink, the water arching toward her like a colorless rainbow. When she stepped away from the fountain, she saw me watching her. She glanced at me somewhat oddly and then crossed the hall, her high heels clicking noisily against the wood floor, and went back into the room. As soon as the door closed behind her, I hurried over to the fountain and twisted the knob. The water shut up, slapping me coldly across the face. I jerked back and startled, then tried again. "Cassie!" I looked around. Jeremy Sims stood at the main entrance of the courthouse, staring down at me. "What's the matter?" I said. Walking, then running, Jeremy came toward me, his arm waving frantically. "Cassie, get away!" he hissed in a whispery cry which filled the empty corridor. "Boy, just what's the matter with you?" As Jeremy reached me, I could see that his face was flushed. "You sick or something?" Jeremy didn't answer. He looked nervously around him. "Cassie, you can't drink from there. You'll best get away before somebody sees you." "You crazy? You ain't Stacy. You can't be telling me what to do." Before I could finish, Jeremy grabbed my arm and pulled me several feet from the fountain. I jerked loose, furious. "Boy, you just wait till we get outside." "Cassie, Cassie," he murmured hoarsely, waving his hand to silence me. There was an urgency in his manner as he turned away and stared down the corridor. I followed his gaze. 3 farmers had just entered. They plodded heavily to the courtroom, opened the door, and disappeared inside. With his eyes still on the door, Jeremy asked where Christopher John and little man were. "Just don't you worry about where they are, 'cause, boy, you done torn your britches with me." Jeremy looked at me now. "Where, Cassie?" Again there was that urgency. "They in there," I said, pointing to the men's room. Without another word, Jeremy rushed over to the door and swung it open. Before the string had pulled it to again, he was at the entrance with little man and Christopher John in tow, with his right arm outspread, keeping little man and Christopher John securely behind him. He searched the corridor. Finding no one there but me, he pushed them out and toward the side entrance. He didn't say a word to me. I followed them, as he no doubt knew I would. Once outside, I lit into him again. "Jeremy, how come you done that, huh? How come you went and pulled me like you done?" Jeremy stopped and looked at me. You just shouldn't have been drinking in there, Cassie." "What do you mean I shouldn't have been drinking in there? I was thirsty." I know, but other folks was drinking there." "Yeah, but, oh, you just make me sick. I wasn't even finished." "I'm just real sorry, Cassie, but..." "You old peckerwood!" Jeremy's face paled as he stared at me through the eyes that were faded blue. Before he could look away, I saw the pain there. "Jeremy!" "Stacy," he said, pointing up ahead and not letting me finish. "Here he come." I looked around. Stacy was coming with Mo beside him. That he was furious was obvious. "Lord of mercy, Cassie, where'd y'all go off to?" he demanded. Anger and relief both mixed in his face. "We been looking all over the place for y'all. Little Willie and Clarence even gone back up to the main road, and they're here the trial's getting started. Now where y'all been?" Jeremy answered for us. "They was in the courthouse, Stacy. Cassie, she was drinking the water, and Christopher John and little man, they was using the toilet." Stacy's face changed. He glanced anxiously from Jeremy to Christopher John, little man, and me, and then back to Jeremy. "Anybody see him?" Jeremy shook his head. "Don't think so. I better be getting back." He turned to go, but as he did so, he looked at me. That awful pain was still there. Then he hurried up the courthouse steps, bouncing the balls of his feet as he walked. I had hurt him, and I knew it. No matter how angry I was at him, I should never have called him what I did. Still, he had wronged me badly, pulling on me like he had, and I wasn't about to forget it. "Stacy, you know what that doggone Jeremy done? He grabbed my arm like this here," I said, replaying the scene by taking hold of Stacy's upper arm, "and just come jerking me away from the water. And I wasn't even finished." Stacy pulled my arm from his grasp. "Just hush up, Cassie. Hush up," he snapped. "That water in there and them toilets, they belong to the white folks. And the white folks don't want no colored folks using neither one. Somebody caught y'all, we'd be in a real mess of trouble. Papa say folks done got killed for less. Doggone it, I was afraid of this. Papa gonna wear us all out as it is. You think I want him worrying about something a whole lot worse? But I don't want to hear no buts. Y'all just stay next to me from now on, you hear?" Little man and Christopher John stared up at Stacy in bewilderment. Mo looked on, his face sympathetic, his manner backing Stacy. You hear? Stacy repeated, demanding an answer. Little man and Christopher John gave him one, but I was too puzzled to answer. There was so much to learn, too much of it bad. Water was water. A toilet, a toilet. Were the people crazy? Stacy seemed to read the question in my eyes, for he nodded, the scowl of anger etching the deeper into his face. Let's get on back, he said, directing us toward the tree where the old man still sat. TJ's in the courtroom. And that is the end of chapter 2. Wow, really long chapter. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.